Hi, welcome back. I am here again. I am Matthew McQuilla, and I am here again with Professor Backer to discuss Hong Kong between one country and two systems. Today, we will be discussing Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is further statement from the authorities on the situation in Hong Kong. It was written Monday, August 5th, 2019. How are you doing, Professor Backer?
Well, great, and really enjoying these conversations about the book. You're making me remember both the time that these things happen and why it is that I wrote these in the way I did. So it's kind of fun. So thank you.
Well, I'm glad we're able to expose this to the readers who plan on indulging in your thoughts that you had while you were writing this in the moment. Um, so today we have this chapter where you talk about pretty much messaging and discourse coming from the central government and also in parts from the protester camp. So first, I would like to start off with asking you about the messaging that came from outside of Hong Kong and this administrative region, whether you discussed from Italy and you talked about from some people who had left Hong Kong. What can you say on that?
Well, right. There are a couple things going on. I'm going to get to your question in a roundabout way.
Okay.
There are a couple things going on. This is now, we're still at the beginning of August. All kinds of things had been happening, uh, through June and July. And I had been focusing really from the end of July until August on something that I thought was kind of interesting and that did not seem to have been picked up very much and certainly by the Western press and Western people who are now gearing up to intervene. And that was the way in which the central authorities, as well as the local authorities, were actually now becoming more and more invested in refining and approaching a discursive response to what they saw happening in Hong Kong. And what was happening in Hong Kong, of course, was that the protests after the explosions in early June, from the mass protests on the 9th to the beginning of violence on the 12th, and then a more and more coordinated series of mass interventions that were meant to be kind of spectacular in the sense that it would draw the attention of both the central authorities and people outside of Hong Kong. These mass interventions that then would put pressure on various points in the political and especially the economic life of Hong Kong. And the resulting loss of patience. Again, I'm trying to be careful. There are a number of ways of describing what went on. The loss of patience, the increasing loss of patience of the local authorities, which then produced a number of counter events, which were also quite spectacular in the way in which they captured the attention both of the central authorities and the West, but again, in very different ways. And so in that context, of course, the protests and the central government's responses, which were both physical on the ground with respect to the police forces, but at this point for me, much more importantly, discursively in the way in which they were now trying to manage or control the narrative of it, becomes important in the way in which that serves to then begin to, I'm trying to be careful here, to help create a structure within which Western intervention and Western commentary or non-Hong Kong commentary can occur, right? And so here you begin to get but again, not developed. And so there's this imbalance that's going on here that you see on the part of the protesters. Much of what's going on is physically discursive. That's the pattern that is emerging between June and the beginning of August. They're banking on people on the streets making politics happen, because effectively they're shut out of LegCo, they're shut out of the central authorities, and there's really no space for them outside of Hong Kong as well. So what the only space that they really have, they think, is not a discursive space, although we can argue about that, but the occupying the physical space that's Hong Kong. In response, right, we have the beginnings of discursive expressions coming in from the West, but much, much more important, I think, in the long term. Although, again, we didn't know it at the time. Although for me, I was scratching my head. Wow, the central authorities are spending a whole lot more time working through a discursive response to what is going on the streets of Hong Kong than anyone else. You have the central authorities developing this discourse. So you've got this chapter 5 kind of shows this kind of very, very different sort of discursive framing on the streets, in the protesters, and then discursively on the part of the central authorities, plus the intervention of the local authorities through the police. So there's this dynamic that's going on, and what I wanted to do in this case was then look at how that sort of was evolving. And so you've got a kind of three-pronged pot here. On the one hand, you've got the people of Hong Kong. They did a survey, which I talk about at the beginning of this chapter. They did a survey that suggested that for the moment, the hearts and minds of Hong Kong people were not with the central authorities, and certainly not with the local authorities. But at the same time, you've got the control of the streets, and then the very, very beginnings, but again, in a kind of not particularly well-developed way, a kind of discursive formulation of what is going on, or the meaning of what's going on the streets of Hong Kong. And then you've got this much more elaborate discursive development on the part of the central authorities with the actions of the police and other forces on the street as well. So in that context, of course, it is, and that's what made chapter 5 kind of interesting. That's the setup within which the voices that you begin to hear increasingly from the West operate. That is, they aren't really intervening in a primary way. They tend to be intervening in a secondary way, more commenting on the shape of the interactions between the parties, rather than serving as any kind of force that has any kind of real effect on what is going on in Hong Kong. It's a very long answer to a very short question, but the question itself was actually quite complicated, even though it sounds very simple.
Understandable. And so when we talk about the central government positioning and the voice coming from the central government on all this, and definitely with their support for the police, you discussed 2 statements, the upper A1 version and lower A2 version, that were released in news outlets. Can you talk about the difference between those 2 statements that were released?
Yeah, that actually what it caught my eye, and the reason it caught my eye was I'd known in other jurisdictions, and my experience really was, for example, in Cuba, it was not uncommon to see statements that would be different, that there would be variations on statements that would be projected to different parties and in different ways. And here what struck me was that you had 2 statements. You would have thought that they would have been identical, but they were not. They were different enough in their emphasis to make me think about what it was that they were trying to say, and then to whom. And of course, you'll have to read the chapter to get into detail. What I say at this point, only that in both of them become critically important, but you don't realize this at the beginning of August. This becomes clear 6 months from then, but it's here again. It's a series of statements starting in chapter 3, I think. So 3, 4, and 5, the central government, the central authorities are now working overtime to develop themes. And these are the baseline approaches that are never abandoned. They are just refined and then repeated over and over. It's like this drumbeat, bam, 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 that forms not just the background sound, but the foundation around which everything, the discourse is then developed, not just by the central authorities, but by everyone else, because you have to deal with it. And in a sense, by doing this, by the beginning of August, and again, only in retrospect, the central authorities have already positioned themselves for victory. We didn't realize this at the time, but it certainly in retrospect and discursively, it appears that way. There's only the control of the streets never metastasized is a bad word, never evolved into something that could then be used to either push or displace those characteristics and systems that the masses out on the street found so disturbing. At the end of the day, they and we'll talk about that is certainly after COVID comes in January, which changes a lot of the dynamic. That winds up being a less effective method than what the central government does. And from my perspective, a critical miscalculation of the constellation of groups that made up the opposition was that by the time they got together enough to begin to develop discursive countermeasures, it may well have already been not enough and not directed in the right way, and they got caught up in this net. But anyway, so that goes back to the two. So in one of them, right, the emphasis is on the characterization of the street itself, right? So you've got the picture behind you, and you can look at it in one of two ways. You've got the mass of Hong Kong people out on the streets by their own presence, their physical bodies speak, right? You can't hear language, but their bodies are speaking, and what their bodies, by being out there, 1 million or so people on the street, they are saying something, and something quite dramatic, to the central authorities direct, to the local authorities directly, and the central authorities indirectly, right? One way of looking at it, right? And that in that context, if you're a Marxist-Leninist and you are, this would be, I guess, more or less a center-right Marxist-Leninist, you would look at this, you might be induced to apply Maoist notions of the mass line, which are now built into the Chinese Vanguard Party's basic line, and say, aha, this is a mass expression. Let's apply our notions of the mass line. They're telling us something. We can then now interpret it, evolve it, turn it into something that is useful, and then bring it back to the people in ways that preserves our position as the guiding social and political vanguard of the nation, all of China as a whole, including Hong Kong, right? So that would have been one way of looking at this. This is a mass line expression. You take it, you digest it, you chew it up, and then you mold it through your guidance and leadership into something that is more in accord with your own working style and your objectives. But that's not what it's done. The other way of looking at this is as a direct challenge to the leadership and guidance authority, the legitimacy of the guidance authority of the vanguard, and a direct challenge to the ultimate structuring of one country, two systems by denying the one country part and using two systems as a gateway towards the one thing. Well, there are a number of things that were unacceptable, but the major thing that would be completely unacceptable, and that is detachment again from the motherland or the fatherland. I forget how they gender the country, from the nation, right? And so one of the things that the discourse then does is to suggest, aha, this is a radical, violent and element that have to be stopped, that they are that in their own counter, in their own resistance to the assertion of what the authorities viewed as the legitimate use of the police power by the state, they expose themselves not as a discursive force in their bodies, but as they describe it, a violent, radicalized element that really mean to undo one country, two systems by engaging in illegal activities. This notion of violence, of radicalization, not of radicalization within the nation, but outside of the nation, and its violence and its which is aimed at defiling national emblems, besieging police stations, that is attacking the very basis of the foundation of order, all of these things. And then they point to independence and detachment, that is the way in which that picture behind you then is radically transformed, right? So that's one of the versions in which they look at it. And then the second version takes the next step. Right. And that is to look at that picture behind you and to say, aha, that's not everyone in Hong Kong. And that indeed, when you talk about Hong Kong, you have to talk about the Hong Kong people who are loyal, right, and who love the nation. And then the Hong Kong people who, by their own actions, now wish to leave the nation and take this territory with them, which is unacceptable. And you've got here the glimmerings of what later on becomes, I think, the foundations for efforts to talk about a great patriotic campaign and distinguishing between those patriotic elements of Hong Kong for which the local and central authorities must act to protect. And then that group of, again, violent, radical, ultimately foreign, either managed, induced, or aligned elements seeking independence. And that's either independence in its full sense or independence in the sense that they develop a system that cannot be touched at all by the central authorities, and that's bad. And so you've got both of those things coming up here. And then in the second one, of course, touching on a theme that will be developed later on. Sorry about the long answers. A theme that will be developed later on to extremely good effect. And that is the theme that it is the great patriotic elements within Hong Kong that are the only ones who grasp the fundamental purpose of two systems within one country, and that is to maintain and to advance notions of prosperity and stability.
Okay, and so I would like to follow that up with a final question on this chapter. And it comes about like when you look at the central government's portrayal of the protesters, do you think that they do a better job of packaging them up and like unifying them than the central protest? I mean, not the central protest, the protesters do for themselves. And by that, I mean, you talking about how the protesters weren't able to come up with a message, a single message from their camp. But the other side, the central government, was able to form a message that was representative of all those who protest, all those who, they created the discourse, they are against the one country. Were they able to unify them before the protesters were, and did that have a detrimental effect on the protesters?
No, I don't, I think ultimately at this point, no. The problem really was that the way the protesting, sorry, I dropped something. The way the protesting was set up was, and again we have to go back to the origins of this on the 9th, really was an effort to get the local authorities to be more directly responsive to them rather than to what they perceive to be the pressure from the central authorities. And that ultimately was what was propelling that constellation of groups that constituted the protesters. This notion that, in fact, they had no vested interest in a very well developed and orchestrated counter view of two systems, other than one that was ultimately grounded in responsiveness. The central authorities then took this and moved it discursively from a very early time into something very different. And that, I think, to some extent, may have caught the protesters or the protest movement people a little by surprise. I keep calling them protesters, but really it's the group of people who are engaged in an effort, given the frustrations of their own interactions with the central authorities, to get the central authorities' attention enough to engage with them. The central authorities, of course, viewed them as completely outside of chains of command and control, in the way in which the institutionalization of engagement was set up in Hong Kong. The protest movement said, well, that's part of the problem, and that's a longer term problem. We want that evolved to a point where, in fact, we get more engagement, and we're worried that the central authorities actually have a different plan in mind, where that engagement becomes much more stylized and packaged in ways that we find not to our liking. And so, given that, I suspect that at least initially there was no sense of a need to come up with some kind of elaborate counter discourse. In retrospect, it probably would have done them some good to develop a discourse of responsiveness and a discourse of loyalty to the structures of two systems in ways that would have at least sounded enough reassuring enough, so that the statement would have been more powerful and more difficult to ignore by the central authorities, and certainly would have gotten traction in the West. But at this point, we don't see it. You're going to see it later. I think by September and October, it becomes a little more. But even so, there really is a very different view about both discourse and objective, even at this point. And really, these early chapters are meant to begin to sketch that out. And then, you connect the dots from here to May of 2020, and you see how, given the choices that are being made on all sides, where these things will wind up when, not all of a sudden, but when, given the way things change between January and May 2020, you have the national anthem and the national securities laws passed, and then the 2 years after that, which is beyond the book, increasingly enforced in ways that you can already begin to see the harbingers of in statements like the ones that are the A1 and A2 statements that are set out in chapter 5.
All right. Well, thank you for answering my questions having to do with chapter 5. Although you're trying to give away the whole book, and granted, it is part of, well, now history and the present and ultimately the future. I'm sure people haven't been checking the news. They want to read the book to get it firsthand.
Absolutely. There's a lot more detail.
There's a lot more detail in the
A lot
book.
more detail. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well,
So
again,
buy the book.
self-promoting as always. So again, thank you for meeting with me and having this conversation about chapter 5 of this book. And like he said, go out and buy the book. Feel free as well to contact Professor Backer with any questions you would like him to relay to me, so that I could ask him during our interviews. We would more than welcome any questions coming from our listeners. Thank you for the conversation. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.